Thank you for that, and thank you for the warm welcome. Okay, where do we start the journey? You've got a timer there, so I'll keep an eye out on it. This is what was known as the Ottoman Empire, and I guess I'm starting here because I'm starting with my parents. So you'll see there that it covers what's known as the Middle East and North Africa, heading down into Sudan as well as towards Iran. 100 years later, it's effectively been swallowed up by the British Empire, where the sun never set across it. You can see there again, the British Empire is pretty much all the way down, includes Sudan, Egypt, and also Iraq. Now, those countries, after the First World War, were simply divided up with straight lines. So you probably know Sykes and Picot. Sykes, a British civil servant, Picot, French one, took rulers across the land, subdivided it. And the problem started pretty much immediately. Pseudo-independence was given, and immediately there's a reaction against a nationalist reaction, an independence movement for all of them to remove colonial rule. And that is still partly here to this day, I guess. There's Baghdad in Iraq, and just south of Khartoum, where my father was born. So Baghdad, where my mother was born, and Khartoum, my father. During their early years, there were multiple revolutions. Essentially, as you know, it's all oil. So by the First World War, most countries had turned to oil, so the concentration was on oil. If your country went for independence, there were other countries funding yet another revolution. At the time when they were about 14, 15, a socialist revolution occurred in both of those countries. At 16, they both opted to go to Berlin, East Berlin. So it was a socialist revolution. The East German state was funding scholarships to study. So they came. They met in East Berlin. It's my mum and dad as kids, 16-year-olds. So you can imagine 16 years old deciding, we're going off to another country. And it's a communist future, a communist, socialist, international future. And they were introduced, obviously, straight into Berlin, learned the language, eventually had 3 kids there. So I was the eldest, introduced immediately right into the center of Berlin. History of that sort of colonial appropriation. And, to this day, I can still remember as a child wandering around these areas. And obviously, these sort of things have the greatest impact. This is actually where we lived. So some of you who are Berliners will know this area. Fischerinsel. Anybody recognize that? I think we lived on the 14th floor there. That was my kindergarten. And that was known as the Ahornblatt. So if anybody remembers, this is where you went and got, as a child, I remember them as free meals. Perhaps they weren't free. But they were communal areas. I think my secondary school, I can't remember what age, sort of about 6 or something, where you get the tutor, was probably just off that. So those are my memories of major reconstruction, new building, if you like, if we have to conjoin it with architecture, as well as the town centre. As a child, it's a celebration. You don't know any different, really. It's fairly inclusive. There's an absolute impetus that this is an international movement, so it's fairly inclusive. Some of you might remember they used to have these sort of events. So it's broad, international, inclusive. But we're reminded, even as children, in class, of what that movement was about, what it was replacing. I joined one of these, the FDJ. So I can remember as a child, the first time I came back to Berlin, I was proudly telling somebody I was a member of the FDJ. They were West German, and they said, like the Hitler Youth. I don't think so. But maybe it was perceived like that for them. These are sort of monuments we visited, reminding us of what that state was replacing. But even as a child, you sort of think there's something not quite right with the state. So as a child, if you remember, I'm going forward one, but look at their neckerchiefs. So these are red neckerchiefs, and this is the stuff we had in East Germany. So as a child, I can't remember, 6 years old, 5 years old, maybe a little bit older, we had to have the blue one. But we noticed when we went to these monuments, occasionally there'd be some Russian children with red ones. We'd ask, oh, why have they got red ones? Well, you will get a red one when you work really hard, when you're a good communist, good socialist. The Russians get theirs automatically. If you tell that to a 5-year-old, I think that doesn't seem fair, does it? Resistance. The class resisted. The next visit to the monument was resisted until we all got red neckerchiefs. As a child, you realize it's not entirely correct. But the ambitions are there. It's an early state. Now, my mother and father didn't stay there forever. They moved eventually to England. They had relatives in England, and we landed in Southend-on-Sea. Does anybody know Southend-on-Sea? No? It's not really on the sea. It's an estuary, in the Thames estuary. And the Thames is tidal. So if you went swimming there, so as a child, my brother and I were desperate to get to the sea at last. Looks quite beautiful there, doesn't it? But when the tide goes out, it will go out for miles. And you're walking in estuarine mud. It's not sand. Never mind. Slowly but surely we worked our way into London, different hospitals my parents worked at. I should mention, yes, they studied medicine here. So forever imposing upon us, not only their political ambitions, but also their ethical ambitions in terms of profession, medicine specifically. They worked from one hospital to another in parts of London, and they arrived in a period when England was going through economic crisis, and this was on the streets all the time. So you remember as a child being informed of what was replacing, the new state was replacing, and then as a 7-year-old, arriving in London and finding out this country that had also helped replace this seemed to be celebrating it. Very confusing for a 7-year-old, especially as the older brothers of some of my school friends would take me on these talks and then marches and introduce me as a German. It's okay, he's German. 10 years later, I go to university, study architecture. I've actually told my parents I'm studying medicine. And my mother says to this day that she has a letter from me saying that broke her heart, where I told her, no, I've enrolled as an architect. This is one of my professors, Izzy Metzstein. Now, he was actually German too. He left when he was about 7 or 8 years old. This is sort of one of his works. Very much interested in the tectonics. I'll come on to that in a moment. Materials and tectonics. But also interested in tectonics, the origins, the etymology of architecture, but the etymology of all things. So here, anybody Italian here? Do you know what this is? How do you say it in Italian? Because I always mispronounce it. Is it fascia? Fascia, yeah. Fascia. Fascia. Thank you. So fascia, stronger together. These sticks bound together. One stick alone will break, but if you bind them together, they're stronger together. So from the Roman Republic period. So what people forget, Rome had 3 periods under Etruscan monarchy. They eventually got rid of that, and they said, we will be republicans. Never under a monarchy or autocracy again. We will be republican. Stronger together as individuals, but bound together, homo faber, man the maker, but not working for your own destiny, but working for our commonwealth, so together. And obviously, interestingly, subverted by the Italian fascists, who eventually took that, because unions used to use that, the idea of fascia, stronger together, left-wing unions, and then subverted by the fascists and turned into fascism. That's where its origins come from. So Izzy and I used to spend our time disaggregating or finding the etymology of not just words, ideas, but obviously also architecture, which eventually leads us to the sort of thing why we do what we do in our office. So if we're talking about the etymology of architecture, and please forgive me if some of you have already come to our lectures and seen this. This is Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari is the author of 16th century author of the most excellent artists, architects, and sculptors. And his specific point, you have to remember, this is the 16th century, the most excellent, he has to include himself among them. His specific point is that as individuals, we are apprenticed, we learn, we become highly skilled, and then become most excellent via innovation, experimentation. But it's you, your personal manner, your idiosyncratic manner. It's also the adoption of humanist philosophy, so he's also talking about the ethics of what you do. Johann Winkelmann, hopefully some of you will know him, German. He's a proto-academic. So this is 200 years later, essentially replacing Vasari's book with the first book that puts into chronological order the art and architecture of the ancient world. It's the period of the Enlightenment, so it's really well adopted. He makes some mistakes. It's a bestseller. He replaces the bestseller or publishes another book with his opinions on the art and architecture of the ancient world. And for him, the white marble art, architecture and sculpture of the Greeks is best because the Greek are democratic. Now, in Northern Europe, this is adopted, highly adopted, and it's the birth of the neoclassical age, Germany, England, mostly in Northern Europe. What he hasn't realized is actually polychrome. But that legacy remains with us, because he began to associate, conflate the architecture, the image, the product, with politics, and specifically the whiteness, with purity, clarity of mind, democracy. And remember, Vasari is talking about individuals who master their craft. So the difference between the two is that one is talking about the process that leads to a product, while the other one, who's not an architect or a sculptor, is talking about the product alone. He's finding collective nouns for styles, for periods, and then adopting them. And because they're conflated with politics, we then adopt them. England's actually the first country to change the education system of architects, masons, very, very quickly, by insisting that no one is allowed to learn with their hands anymore. They don't learn materials, whether it's stone, timber, their assembly, but they actually just learn to draw, the classical, the neoclassical specifically. Obviously, the master of the neoclassical eventually was Schinkel. Schinkel sought all over Europe. He comes to England during the industrial period. He's sent by the Prussian Crown Prince to look at the British Museum as it's being designed, specifically for the Altus Museum. But he's also sent to investigate the Industrial Revolution across England, Scotland, and Wales. And he begins to make these drawings and notes, which eventually lead to the Bow Academy. But for him, it's a bit of a shock. Construction seems to be the birth of architecture. In other words, there's a new process. It's the modern age, industrial age. There's new materials, there's new programs. They seem to be leading to the architecture. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the neoclassical. You will know, this seems to be a homage to Germany, Berteker and Semper, who help develop those ideas of tectonics, Kernform and Kunstform, and ultimately the idea that the articulated joint, the joining and binding, and then eventually the emblematic cultural completion of those of that architecture. Same thing happening in northern France, and obviously in the UK as well. And who are the pupils, the first pupils? I'll run through these quickly. Obviously we know Otto Wagner and the Postbank and the expression of assembly and eventually decoration. And not enough of us know that Henri van der Velde actually gave birth to the Bauhaus. So he was employed in Weimar and conjoined the two. But it was after the First World War and he wasn't allowed to be head, so he put Walter Gropius. But my point is, it's the first time in 100-odd years that students were allowed to work with materials right from their first week all the way through and find a new language, a new design or architectural language. Now, at exactly the same time in Spain, we had Federico de Onis teaching arts, specifically literature, who was teaching Dali, Buñuel, and Lorca. And he coined the idea of postmodernity. Why, remember, the idea of modernity had been around since the Industrial Revolution. He's saying, why should we be following a dogma at all? We should be international. We should be inclusive of all cultures, all ideas, all genders, all sexualities, and so on. This is 1920, so quite early for us, I guess. 50 years later, Ihab Hassan in Milwaukee operates a series of conferences to which he invites Jean-François Lyotard, and the postmodern condition is born, as it were, reborn in the 1970s. Now, I labor this because as architects, we have a problem. We are still educated in the way that the post-industrial revolution period of England and Schinkel and others complained about, which is that we're interested in the product, not the process. We don't even understand the process. Half of the vocabulary of making is removed from us because we're not educated that way. We're educated in the product, the outcome. So we tend to play with products. Jenks challenged that roughly at the same period as Ihab Hassan and François Lyotard were developing the postmodern condition. And his original publication was New Radicalism, for which poster boys were people like, well, a number of them actually, and as well as Gaudi. And then his editor said there's a word going around, postmodernity. Why don't we change the title, change the content slightly, and without fail, we return to the product. We begin to discuss one product after another, and unlike Jenks's initial concept, which was here are people who've become masters of their particular skill, and they're innovating with it. In the same way that Vasari would discuss that, it eventually just becomes yet another product, and of course, one after the other, with the same perennial questions as these are. This is Edward R. Ford, hopefully you know him, asking the same question as Semper, Bertica, and Schinkel did 100-odd years beforehand. Now, why does that matter? Why does it matter that we need to know how things are made? Does it matter? Ultimately, it's just what we see, isn't it? We walk down the street and we see the facade. That facade could be 1 millimeter thick. Who cares? This is how we build today. Pretty much every building we see, superstructure, insulation, vapor check, suspended facades of one description or another. Innovations where the facade is nothing but wallpaper. Well, it matters because people do things like hang bricks from balconies, so go up the wall, underneath, and across the balcony, and within a couple of years they fall down. Okay, luckily this happened in the middle of the night, so nobody was hurt. So, I mean, you walk around London, and hopefully this is not the case for you guys, but the underside of this, somebody's pressed a button on their computer. It's a brick wash. But they're real bricks on plywood, glued to plywood. Yeah. Is that the bell? Should I get off?
Almost.
A steel surround, again, glued to plywood. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Does it matter? Well, let's come to that. More Germans. Hannah Arendt. So remember, her teachers were essentially thinking of the industrial period. Animal laborans. The labor you make just to feed yourself, to keep a roof over your head. If you have another type of profession, you might be homo faber, undertaking ethical outcomes for our mutual benefit. Her student is Richard Sennett, who's of our modern age, more modern age, where he knows that all of us, no matter whether you're a computer programmer, an architect, a surgeon, you're getting highly skilled. And your skill ought to overlap with your ethical purpose. What's the point in being highly skilled as an architect, especially if we're architects? That's what the evening is about. Highly skilled without ethical purpose. What are those ethical purposes? Well, we talked about Federico de Onis introducing the idea of postmodernity, the postmodern condition. It's nothing new. This is Protagoras in 400 BC, 500 BC, also saying that we constantly need to renegotiate our ethical outcomes, our ethical intentions. What are they for architecture? Well, again, 2,000 years old. Firmness, commodity delight, structural integrity, cost, equity, and delight, perhaps some beauty. Well, these are all obvious. We already have laws for these, don't we? Yeah. Obviously, in the UK, try to introduce laws for style and beauty. Thankfully, that government has gone, and the new government immediately scrapped that. But I'm going to concentrate on one in the last couple of slides. Embodied carbon. So can I go back one? Just burn this into your retinas. This is the agreed method for measuring the embodied carbon of a building. Sections A, B, C, materials, operational, and reuse. Here are the materials that all of us, if we cared, if we knew what we're building, instead of pressing a button saying brick wash or some other image, if we cared, we knew what those materials were, quickly find out, right at the bottom, sequestrating materials, biomaterials, timber. This means that if you're making sure those materials are reused, your building has now taken CO2 out of the atmosphere and made life better. Stone, the next. And right at the top, obviously, aluminium. Now, the reason we color-coded it was to be like a supermarket shopping experience. You're going through the supermarket, and some of you, I know, I'm looking around, are already just filling it with red. Red. Cigarettes, whiskey, Wurst. Having a lovely time at home, but highly likely not to be around for very long. And you never want to go to this person's dinner party, do you? Boiled cabbage. But perhaps you just want to mix them. The cabbage with some fried lardons. That's really what that list is about. Is it possible to mix it and still stay negative in your carbon? Lastly, almost there. But stone, if we all did too much wood and stone, surely we'd run out of stone? Well, we're sitting on boiling magma. The Earth is just one giant boiling magma ball. We're never going to run out of stone. One quarry for stone. Look at all the different quarries that are needed for steel, cement. And cement loses 60% of its strength when it was originally a piece of limestone block. You have to reinforce it with steel to bring the strength back up. Which sounds absurd, doesn't it, when you put it like that? So if you're sticking to those materials, you'll bring the embodied carbon of your building down. That's my last ethical message. Sorry for the long, shaggy dog story.
Regarding to you have talked about many sources of knowledge and inspiration for you. There's one experience I definitely wanted to ask you about, and it's the case of that building that we saw on the screen with the stone facade, 15 Clerkenwell Close.
Yeah.
Can you explain what happened with that building? Because the government ordered to...
How much time?
Yeah, like in a couple of minutes to say what to our audience, to let them know what happened.
We got planning approval very easily, which is by what's called delegated powers, because less than 5 of our neighbors said it was an ugly building. As long as the threshold is less than 5, you can get, the planning department will stamp it through. Okay. More than 5, it has to go to a local politician. When we finished building it, one of our neighbors, called Sir William Goodenough,
a nice person.
He ran a company that makes packaging and advertising. And he said he hated the building. And we said, well, so don't really like your packaging either. What's the... but he went to a local politician, not in our neighborhood actually, who sits on the planning committee and said, how did you allow this building to pass? And the local politician said, I didn't. I never saw it. It must be illegal. And he was going for re-election. So he went immediately to the press and said, this illegal building, I will see it demolished. And the press obviously phoned me. And this is a lesson for all of you.
How old were you at the moment? At that time?
How old?
Yes, I mean that
I wasn't
experience.
7.
That experience.
It was
shocking
when was it?
for the office.
20. When was it? 2015, 2017, thereabouts.
So 20 years old, 25.
Yeah.
But the office was still the office. It was the building office. Your apartment.
Yeah, exactly. Well? That's right. Our home. But yeah, no. I foolishly told the journalist who phoned up. This is absurd. Of course, we've got planning. You can't build without planning. You can't get a bank loan. No builder could get a loan. Obviously, all the documents have to be in place. The man is an idiot. The politician is an idiot. He should just get up off his lazy backside. The planning department's in the same building and pull out the file, which he did. And then still put a demolition order on it. So for 2 years, we waited to find what's called a public inquiry. So this is where people, lawyers in England, the ones that wear wigs, barristers, will sit there, and you have to swear an oath and tell the truth, nothing but the truth. And the other side, their witness was the guy, the enforcement officer, the head of the enforcement team who put the demolition notice up, and he had to swear an oath, and he was asked, what's happened to all this information? Because we have copies of it, but it's not in the department. And his first answer, so it's 2 years it took that long to get to that point. I removed it. I was asked to remove it all. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So instantly, it's all legal. It's proven to be legal. At the end of it, I'm tugging the shirt of the barrister, asking, "What happens now? Surely they're going to compensate us, and we sue them." He said, "Yes. This case is about proving that it was always legal. The next case is you sue them for tens of millions of pounds, and but I have to pay him, the barrister, £500,000 because that's how much they cost, plus expert witnesses, and spend half my time writing reports." And
I mean that was a huge. You said actually it would have cost you the bankruptcy at the time.
Yeah, they weren't going to do it for no win, no fee, or a percentage of the.
No, but they are. Yeah. And also, the project got awards. That was also a funny point. That was a recognized RIBA project.
Yeah,
that suddenly is.
Honestly, it's just the more you dig up. You've opened a can of worms here, because at one point it was being shortlisted for Sterling, and it suddenly had to be pulled. And about years later, the head of the awards committee came to see me, and it was like a mea culpa, having to admit something that has clearly been gnawing him, for years. And he confessed that his the friend of his father, who's a Labour councillor, who was a Labour politician who made the mistake, had phoned him and said, "Please remove it from the list because it's going to be an embarrassment for our
this person
political
did
party."
It actually.
And he pulled it, knowing that it'll come back the following year. It's all very, very peculiar.
What is if we can put it in short, what was your takeaway from the whole experience, what this whole process that you?
I think I buried it until you just brought it up again, and now I'm having a trauma.
Yeah,
in front of.
I mean,
I'm going to have to lie on a couch after this. Thank you for the trauma.
No, I mean. Okay. It was a hard experience. It's good to know that it's unbelievable. And I can imagine what you went through. So sorry for bringing up the trauma. Now you will be able to relax. But just one question. Just one more question. Your office is an employee
ownership trust.
Trust.
Yeah.
What is, in short, what do you think you feel? It's the positive thing about it, and also the challenging thing about it, knowing you work at Zaha Hadid before, which is definitely not an employee
ownership
trust.
No.
So maybe they could do it. Maybe it's good to know for them what the positive things are, the negatives.
I don't know what they're doing now. They might. I'm not even sure if they're heading that way or have.
Anyway,
yeah.
but what is for you?
Well, you know,
employee ownership trust.
Different period and different background. You know, Zaha had struggled on her own for a very long time, and then when work started coming in and lots of it. She was quite happy to hold on to it.
Yeah, I imagine that was also the part. That's another topic.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what do you feel it's employee ownership trust? What's the positive thing and the bad thing in a regular architecture office?
I would recommend it to anybody. I mean, ultimately, we all know if you're an employee in a practice or you're running the practice, it's not you alone. Clearly, not you alone. Yes, you might be driving it, you might be the originator of it, but nothing would happen without the army of people who become your friends and colleagues, and they can't be left to feel as if their contribution is purely a monthly salary. So it's a way of clearly allowing everybody to feel an equal partner.
Yeah.
So that's what an employee ownership trust is.
Challenges?
Well, the challenges. I don't think, for me, they're not. The challenges are really warming the new arrivals into the idea because they don't quite understand what it is. I mean, really, every practice, once it's been going for 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is, even a lifetime, and I was just briefly speaking to somebody who's third generation practice, is a platform. So these platforms attract clients, they've got existing clients, and they're there for the new people to take advantage of. That new work is coming in. Can they do something else different, innovate with it, that will be different from the generation that maybe established it? So it's a platform that exists. You don't have to start from scratch. Accelerates the possibilities of those individuals that join it. Obviously, they have responsibilities as well as rewards.
It's a good model, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll have to continue our conversation later with a round of discussion, but
Sure.
for the moment, thank you a lot for your talk
you.
and for the conversation. Thank you.